BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Knidheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery, and in this episode, I will be looking at some comments that have been attributed to Frederick George Abberline, a key player in the history of Jack the Ripper. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Frederick Abberline is somebody who has a very large impact in the world of ripperology. He has been featured in numerous movies, TV shows, and documentaries, and he's even been listed by some as being the most critical and most central figure in the story of Jack the Ripper. But as we're going to see in this episode, that is highly contested. Frederick Abberline was born on January 8th of 1843, and he passed away on December 10th of 1929. To provide the most basic introduction, he was a British chief inspector for the London Metropolitan Police, and he is best known for being a prominent police figure in the investigation of Jack the Ripper. And I think that most people will recognize him from the 1988 miniseries with Michael Caine, where Caine played Frederick Abberline, as well as the movie From Hell, where he is played by Johnny Depp. What I wanted to do with this episode was really look at some of the comments that Frederick Abberline, as a historical figure, had made about the Jack the Ripper suspects. And as we're going to see, there's a lot of info that's going around. Well, let's try to separate the fact from the fiction. And one of the books that I decided to revisit was Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia by John J. Edelston. And there's a section on a particular Jack the Ripper suspect named George Chapman. And if you do a quick Google search on George Chapman, it won't take you too long before you come across something about how Frederick Abberline was an individual who was an inspector on the case who claimed that Jack the Ripper had been identified in his mind, and it was George Chapman. So I'm going to have a read here from Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia. It has been suggested that George Chapman was also Jack the Ripper. The only evidence for this claim is that Chapman was in Whitechapel at the time of the murders, operating a barber shop in Cable Street, and that he had once been a barber surgeon in Poland. And George Chapman, of course, was born under the name of Severin Klasowski. It has also been said that when Chapman was arrested by George Godley, Inspector Frederick George Abberline remarked, "I see you've got Jack the Ripper at last." But, contrary to popular belief, this statement is certainly untrue, because Aberline later reported that he became suspicious of Chapman only during the trial. And I think that that's something very important to note, because I think that the opinions of somebody who has been following the story for a very long time or trying to zero in on a suspect would be quite different and could be viewed in a different light than somebody who is looking at everything in retrospect and in hindsight, and then once someone else is arrested for a different set of crimes, then they begin to suspect this person of committing the Jack the Ripper crimes. And what they're talking about is George Chapman was a real serial killer known as the Burrow Poisoner, and those are the crimes that he was arrested for. A very different set of homicides, but I do have a standalone episode about him if you would like to hear some things that are in more detail. But let's keep going with Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia. It should be remembered that whoever Jack the Ripper really was, he knew the dark alleys of Whitechapel very well, and that was something that could not be said for the 22-year-old stranger from Poland. It is also highly unlikely that someone who butchered prostitutes with such ferocity would later turn to poisoning his victims. In addition, Chapman lived far to the east of the center of the murders, quite a distance from the Elizabeth Stride murder in Berner Street. His coloring did not match any of the reasonable descriptions of a man seen with any of the victims, and it is believed that throughout his adult life he sported a bushy black mustache. In short, the evidence is tenuous or non-existent. And when I did my first suspect profile episode on George Chapman, I was thinking something like what John J. Edelston said, that almost certainly not, or I think that it goes into the category of, hey, I suppose it's possible. He's not the worst suspect out there. Serial killer in England at the time, in London at the time, animosity toward women. Okay, it's possible, but unlikely. But the more time that I've spent looking at George Chapman, the more I see that people are actually building a certain case for him being Jack the Ripper. And some of these strikes against him are certain points that I don't think are necessarily very strong, that he was too far from Bernard Street. He doesn't match the description of any of the men that were seen in Whitechapel near or around the victims prior to the murders. Well, it's entirely possible that nobody got a good look at Jack the Ripper, or no credible witness that is on file actually got a good look at as to what the Ripper's description truly was. But, should the opinion of Frederick Abberline mean something to us? Because I really have found that a lot of people zone in on two other individuals from law enforcement, and they are Robert Anderson and Donald Swanson. And Donald Swanson was more or less the person whom I've gathered, and I think the best way of putting it is that he was in charge of the information. All of the information about the Ripper case was supposed to go through him. And the thing I was hesitating to say is that he knew more about the case than anybody else. But that was ultimately what his job was, and very famously, Swanson and Anderson were going to make comments about a particular individual named Aaron Kosminski. Or let's be clear, Kosminski. There is a Kosminski that they think was Jack the Ripper. And when we look at other true crime cases, I really don't find that the opinions of law enforcement are too valuable. Because when you're dealing with these high-profile cases like the Zodiac Killer and D.B. Cooper and the Black Dahlia, guess what? They're still unsolved. Just because somebody has a personal pet suspect or somebody thinks that they've identified the case, no. I mean, we mostly know who it was. It's just they weren't convicted. Well, if everybody were coming to the same conclusion, then you might have something. But very clearly here, we can see that people are not coming to the same conclusion. You just heard that statement about how Frederick Abberline would ultimately suspect George Chapman over Aaron Kosminski, or Anderson suspect, as we should say. We have Aberline suspect and Anderson suspect. And I actually just want to read a couple more things, though, about George Chapman before we truly move on. And this will relate to his activities as the borough poisoner. Once George Chapman had been arrested for murder, the police began to look at him for the deaths of Isabella and Bessie, two other wives. Both bodies were exhumed, Bessie's on November 22nd and Isabella's on December 9th, and both were found to have been remarkably well preserved, a sign of antimony poisoning, and the subsequent post-mortems showed 3.83 grains of tartar emmerich in Isabella and 2.129 grains in Bessie. On December 31st, Chapman was charged with 2 more murders. So these poisonings are very discreet. And again, this is something that is a very big surprise to a lot of people about how a poisoner is going to go on to become a suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, or one that has been thought so highly of by Frederick Abberline. But ultimately, I can understand the rationale a little bit more, and I really began to consider George Chapman more differently when I heard Dr. Lee Meller, a criminologist, say, at first, he completely dismissed Chapman by saying, yeah, a poisoner? I mean, Jack the Ripper going to become a poisoner? That seems like a downgrade, and it seems like, if anything, Jack the Ripper's behaviors and crimes would have escalated. But then he learned, as a criminologist, that people commit crimes in different ways for different reasons, and maybe Frederick Abberline was onto something. But some of the opinions and ideas of Frederick George Abberline are also discussed in a different book that I've talked to you guys about here on Ripper Wednesday, and it's Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy. And this is one that I've mentioned before. I have a standalone episode on the introductory segments, and I've also used this as a resource for an episode about Charles Lechmere called The Lechmere Legacy here on Black Box Online Radio's Ripper Wednesday. And one more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe. And I would like to look at an article that was written by Claire Smith, and it's called The Depiction of Inspector Abberline. And this actually begins with a quotation from the 2007 movie Zodiac. Yes, that's right, not a Jack the Ripper movie, but Zodiac. There is more than one way to lose your life to a killer. That is a tagline from the film Zodiac. That film tells the story of the Zodiac Killer, arguably the world's most infamous unidentified serial killer after Jack the Ripper. The film traces how the lives of the people investigating the crimes are destroyed by their search for the killer, even though they are not victims of violence. In the same way as their on-screen inspector suffers in his search for the Zodiac Killer, Frederick Abberline is a victim of Jack the Ripper. His posthumous reputation has been destroyed. He is shown as suffering from drug and alcohol addiction, attempted murder, and colluding with the conspiracy to protect the identity of the culprit. Inspector Aberline, along with all of the police involved in the investigation of the Jack the Ripper case, were victims, and they failed to catch the killer. Indeed, there is a negativity that is used to depict the police in general in films about Jack the Ripper. Well, I think that this is tying into some things from Johnny Depp's From Hell, as well as perhaps Michael Caine's film, but definitely the From Hell movie. Now, did Frederick Abberline actually know the truth about Jack the Ripper, and was he just holding back? And then did he just come forward years later and say, oh yeah, this Chapman poisoner, that was definitely the guy? I don't think so. I really don't think so. I think those are the stories that are more suitable for Hollywood, for novels, and fiction. And overall, though, I don't really think that he was colluding with anybody. I don't think he was conspiring with anybody to hide the real secrets about Jack the Ripper's identity. The public perception of the police force in 1888 was not favorable. It may be argued that the police fall from grace in the public consciousness occurred in 1860 with the investigation of the murder of Frances Saville Kent by Jack Wisher, in which her examination of the case, Kate Summerscale writes that before the police detectives were perceived as figures of mystery and glamour, the surreptitious, all-seeing gods of London. However, after the Witcher had literally aired the family's dirty laundry and brought charges against one of the daughters of the house, this perception shifted, and the detectives became a shadowy figure, a demon as well as a demigod, and this unfavorable perception was further developed by the Contagious Diseases Act, repealed in 1886, which allowed the police to accuse a woman of prostitution on sight. At least one woman committed suicide as a result of the fake accusations. So what I think this is trying to say is that in the early 1800s, perhaps, there was this desire to spread a depiction of police officers as very reliable, strong, and also doing their jobs, honest and hardworking. By the late 1800s, the public perception of police officers in the country wasn't seen as unfavorable, and by the late 1880s, there were a lot of problems and conflicts between the people of England and law enforcement. You just heard there about the Contagious Diseases Act of 1886. And would something like this affect the investigations into Jack the Ripper? I don't know if it would affect the investigations. I think it might affect the way that certain key figures in the Ripper case were portrayed in the media, or how people are remembering key members of law enforcement, and people are going to look at them in somewhat of an unfavorable light. But I will also tell you firsthand that some people are simply desiring to stir the pot and fuel the fires of conspiracies. In 1887, the year before the Ripper murders, two more events further damned the police in the eyes of the public. Firstly, the publication of W.T. Stead's series of articles, The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, which campaigned against child prostitution. In these articles, the police came across as uncaring and ineffective, joking with Stead as if they ran into every home, screaming and they heard they would attend more childbirths than doctors. Well, I guess this just goes to show some nasty public sentiment. And for the working classes, the death knell for the police's reputation as heroes came with the police's response to the Bloody Sunday demonstration of 1887. The police, especially Sir Charles Warren, were viewed as having overreacted to the presence of protesters in Trafalgar Square. This view was still held during the Whitechapel murders. In a letter to the Daily Telegraph on September 19th, the blunders were said that they to have been by a series of angry mobs in Trafalgar Square and made dangerous. During the murders, the press were very, very critical. Of all the police who investigated the murders, it is Inspector Aberline who is given the most screen time of any, and his presentation has more depth and thought. While the upper ranks of the police are callous and the lower ranks are bumbling, Aberline is depicted as genuinely caring about the victims, with a determination to catch the killer. Yet Aberline is still presented in a negative fashion on screen, and his life transformed into fiction. I believe this loss of identity makes him a victim of the Ripper. Well, we also have to remember that in many stories that are featured in Hollywood, they're going to try to create some type of conflict to make things interesting for the audience. If everything is just perfect throughout the story and the characters have no struggles at all, then a lot of people wouldn't want to watch that. A lot of people wouldn't want to see that on film. Yes, are going to give the protagonist something to deal with, some types of internal struggles. They're creating story arcs and character arcs and all of that stuff. But that has not so much connected to the real-life depictions of Jack the Ripper, because I think that this is something that really just gets separated from the truth. Like, we have the fact and the fiction, and it seems like Frederick Abberline was somebody who was a very useful character to portray, because, as you've already heard, he wasn't the most high-ranking member of law enforcement, and he's not the most central figure to the Jack the Ripper case. So using a figure like Frederick Abberline might be more beneficial to some people, rather than choosing a figure such as Sir Charles Warren or Donald Swanson, because they are more authoritative, and you would have somebody who's at a lower rank but still trying to solve the Ripper case. Before looking at how Aberline is transformed into a fictional character, it is necessary to present the facts of his life. Frederick Abberline was born in Dorset in 1843 and worked as a clocksmith until 1863. During his police service, Aberline worked in Whitechapel from 1873 until 1887, and was so well thought of in the area that he was presented with a watch left by residents, and it was a mark of respect. In 1888, Aberline was married, and he married his second wife in 1876. In 1888 he was married, but he had married his second wife in 1876, okay? And they were together until his death in 1929. In his spare time, Aberline enjoyed gardening, and after he left the police force, he worked for the Pinkertons Detective Agency, policing the gaming rooms in Monte Carlo before retiring to Bournemouth. And one more time, this is from the book Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy, one that I've talked to you guys about here on Black Box Online Radio in the past. And overall, I think you can see that he is a very useful figure for becoming a hero in the story of Jack the Ripper, somebody who is developing a certain passion about the case. But did he settle on the right person, George Chapman? I mean, I think that perhaps John J. Edelstein mostly got this right, and that is that George Chapman was somebody who is just a mediocre suspect, somewhere in the middle, not the worst, not the best, but maybe worthy of more consideration. And there is one final thing that I'll leave you guys with for the Aberline suspect episode, and it comes to us from the news coverage of 2022. I used to do a segment called the Anything Goes Friday segment, and I did an episode called A Russian Jack the Ripper Suspect. And at the time, the Wednesday show was a revolving panel of topics where I had been talking about the Long Island serial killer, the Phantom Killer, and the Axeman of New Orleans. And I did a couple of Jack the Ripper episodes for the Anything Goes Friday, talking about the Openshaw letter and then the Russian Jack the Ripper suspect, and then ultimately Charles Letchbeer, and I realized, you know what? Why not just make the Wednesday show about Jack the Ripper? And that gave us the creation of Ripper Wednesday. But in terms of that quote-unquote Russian Jack the Ripper suspect, this was related to the news story about how a cane was discovered in the archives that reportedly belonged to Inspector Frederick George Abberline. And this cane featured a wooden composite carving of his top suspect, and the only composite of the real Jack the Ripper. And, that's debated to this day, years later. But according to the article that I read that time, it was Dr. Alexander Petachenko in the cane, that's who the suspect was, and that Frederick Abberline's suspect was secretly Dr. Alexander Petachenko, not George Chapman. And ultimately, I think that news story, which was shared in The Guardian, mind you, was a giant blend of fact and fiction all the same. I mean, we've been talking so much in this episode about how George Chapman has been accused of all of these different crimes. We've been talking about how Frederick Abberline was depicted on film and in the history books, and now we're even seeing this play out in the 21st century, where people are taking real stories and real historical figures, and then they're attributing different ideas and opinions to them, and it's all blended to a point where sometimes the person who wrote that article might have even just been making it up. Sometimes people are just making it up. I mean that, number one, that was an actual composite of the real Jack the Ripper. Number two, that person was actually depicting Frederick Abberline's favorite suspect, and that was some cane that he wanted saved in the archives. Number three, that the person in that cane composite was Alexander Petachenko. Number four, that Alexander Petachenko was even a real person. Because when I did my standalone episode on him, I was fully aware of this. I mean, this is the biggest criticism against Alexander Petachenko as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and that is that he might have just been a fictional character. He may have never existed, and it was just another wild story. And ultimately, I'm going to turn it over to you guys. What do you think about any of the statements that have been made in this episode? Do you think that a suspect like George Chapman was Jack the Ripper? Do you think that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper? Do you think that Alexander Petachenko was Jack the Ripper? And if hypothetically, Frederick Abberline had a single suspect and thought very highly of him, do you think that deserves some type of credence? I hope I was clear when I said I don't think too highly of the opinions of law enforcement. All of that comes from the Zodiac case. All of that comes from my experiences following the Zodiac case, because you find that the reasons why people zone in on particular suspects usually are not very good when they're held up under scrutiny. But as we're also going to see, some members of law enforcement are going to zone in on Kosminski. Some are going to zone in on George Chapman. Maybe somebody zoned in on Alexander Petachenko. But my honest answer is, I don't even believe that cane is a depiction of Alexander Petachenko. It could be somebody else entirely. It could be a different fictional character. One of the propositions was that it's actually a character named Monk Martin from the fictional story The Curse Upon Mitre Square by J.F. Brewer. Mad Monk Martin in the story. So I think that it really is just ambiguous, and that was just a giant red herring in the news. It was a distraction, and it was something purely unhelpful to the Jack the Ripper mystery. But I kid thee not, when members of law enforcement are analyzing the facts, they are not perfect. I know we want to think that, they're police officers, and they're just like, they have these, brilliant insights, and they really know what they're talking about, but ultimately, their ideas are not perfect, and they're only human, and they're subject to the same flaws as everybody else. What do you think about any of the suspects that have been discussed in this episode? And one more time, the books that I've been discussing are Jack the Ripper and Encyclopedia by John J. Edelston, and Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy by the Whitechapel Society. You guys know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. And on Instagram, blackboxned88. And normally I release shorts and reels Monday through Friday here on YouTube, as well as on Facebook and Instagram, talking about serial killers, true crime news, and anything under the sun or in the darkness. This show comes to you Monday through Friday, talking about the Zodiac Killer, the disappearance of Maura Murray, Jack the Ripper, the Black Dahlia, and D.B. Cooper. And you can also get the images that you see going by on the screen available at True Crime Designs. True Crime Designs on Facebook. And you can download this show for free anywhere you get your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and iHeartRadio, under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout-out on Zodiac Monday. And that's all for me now. Everybody have a wonderful Wednesday, and I'll see you tomorrow for a new episode about the Black Dahlia. Until next time.